16 months ago, Canada expelled India's High Commissioner. 6 diplomats thrown out. Relations frozen. Trade talks dead. Nobody was talking. And now, $5.5 billion in signed deals. A uranium contract worth $2.6 billion that runs until 2035. 22 million pounds of Canadian uranium heading to India for nuclear power generation. And a handshake that just rewrote the future of both countries. That's the distance Mark Carney covered in one trip. 4 days, 5 major agreements, and a target to more than double trade to $70 billion a year by 2030. But here's the part nobody's explaining. How do you go from expelled diplomats to billions in signed contracts in just over a year? That story involves a phone call, a crisis that forced both countries to the table, and a number buried in this agreement that makes the whole thing irreversible. If you want to understand how Canada is building partnerships that don't depend on Washington, subscribe and hit the bell, because this is just the beginning. To understand what Carney just pulled off, you need to understand how broken this relationship was. October 2024. Ottawa. The RCMP holds a press conference. They announce they have evidence tying Indian government agents to violent criminal activity on Canadian soil, including the assassination of a Canadian citizen. 6 Indian diplomats, including the High Commissioner, are named as persons of interest. Canada asks India to waive their diplomatic immunity and cooperate. India refuses, so Canada expels them, all 6. India responds by expelling 6 Canadian diplomats from New Delhi, trade talks suspended, student visas collapsing, the relationship functionally dead. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a disagreement over tariffs. This was accusations of murder on Canadian soil. Both sides publicly calling the other's claims absurd. 40 diplomats pulled out of India the year before. 3 Canadian consulates closed. The kind of collapse that takes a generation to repair. And what did that mean for you? It meant a market of 1.4 billion people, the world's most populous country, effectively closed to Canadian exports. It meant businesses that had invested years building relationships in India watching it all disappear. It meant energy deals, tech partnerships, and agricultural exports all sitting frozen while the two governments refused to talk. That's what Carney inherited, a diplomatic crater, no communication, no path forward, and an economy increasingly squeezed by American tariffs, looking desperately for somewhere else to sell. Now here's the part most coverage skips entirely. How do you go from expelled diplomats to $5.5 billion in 4 days? The answer starts with something Carney did that no Canadian PM had done in over 2 decades. After Carney took office in March 2025, he did something nobody expected. He picked up the phone, not through intermediaries, not through carefully staged diplomatic channels. He reached out directly, and here's what made the difference. He didn't relitigate the past. He focused entirely on the future. Within months, envoys were restored to both countries. By the end of 2025, more engagement had happened between the Canadian and Indian governments than in the previous 2 decades combined. That's not spin. That's what Carney said standing next to Modi in New Delhi. And Modi didn't disagree. Now here's where the numbers start to matter. March 2nd, 2026, Hyderabad House, New Delhi. Carney and Modi meet for a private 35-minute session, then a 90-minute meeting with their full delegations. And when they emerge, they announce 5 memorandums of understanding covering energy, critical minerals, technology, AI, talent, culture, and defense. But the centerpiece, the one that changes everything, is the uranium deal. Saskatoon-based Cameco signs a contract with the Indian government. 22 million pounds of uranium. $2.6 billion, running from 2027 to 2035. That's not a handshake. That's an 8-year supply contract locked in, while India plans to expand nuclear capacity from 8 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts by 2047. And that's not all. HCL Technologies, one of India's largest IT firms, announces it's opening AI centers in Calgary and Mississauga and expanding in Vancouver. taking employment from 3,000 to 5,250. Indian pharmaceutical company OCT Therapies commits to manufacturing medicines in New Brunswick. Canada joins the International Solar Alliance. Both countries launch a strategic energy partnership covering LNG, hydrogen, and critical minerals. And then the big announcement. They're targeting a comprehensive free trade agreement by the end of 2026. The goal? More than double two-way trade to $70 billion a year by 2030, from $9 billion to $70 billion. That's not recovery, that's acceleration. Modi, standing next to Carney, says something remarkable. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Carney hasn't even completed 1 year in office, yet relations have leapt forward by a light year. That's the Indian Prime Minister giving a Canadian leader full credit on the world stage. When was the last time you saw that? So what does this actually mean? Let me break it down. 16 months ago, Canada and India weren't talking. Today, they just signed $5.5 billion in commercial agreements. That's not just a turnaround, that's one of the fastest diplomatic reversals in modern Canadian history. But here's why this matters more than the headlines suggest. This deal can't be undone easily. The uranium contract runs through 2035. That's not a promise, that's a locked-in supply agreement with one of the world's largest and fastest growing nuclear programs. India's energy demand is projected to double by 2050. They need this uranium. Saskatchewan has it. The contract is signed. The IT expansion. Those AI centers in Calgary and Mississauga don't just appear and disappear. HCL is committing to hiring 2,250 additional Canadian workers. That's infrastructure. That's investment. That takes years to build and nobody walks away from easily. And the free trade agreement target? Both leaders have now publicly committed to finishing it by December. When you make that announcement standing next to each other on the world stage, backing out becomes politically costly for both sides. Now here's the bigger picture. Canadian pension funds have already invested $73 billion in India. That's not new money. That's Canadian retirement security tied directly to Indian growth. When Carney strengthens this relationship, he's not just opening a market. He's protecting investments that millions of Canadians are counting on. This isn't about replacing American trade overnight. It's about building options. It's about making sure that when any single partner becomes unreliable, Canada has somewhere else to turn. And with 1.4 billion people and an economy growing faster than almost anywhere else on Earth, India is exactly the kind of partner that makes that possible. If you think more Canadians need to understand what just happened, not just the headline, but the details, hit the like button. It pushes this to people who are still only hearing one side of the story. And if you want to help this reach more Canadians who might not find it otherwise, share it. It's free. And it makes a real difference. The next few months matter. If Canada and India hit their target, a full free trade agreement by December, it won't just be the biggest bilateral deal Canada has signed in years. It'll be proof that this country can move fast when it needs to. But there's a bigger question here. This trip to India was part of a larger tour. Australia and Japan came next. Carney isn't just building individual relationships. He's constructing a network. The kind of network that works whether Washington is cooperative or not. My question for you, does this hold? Do Canada and India actually get to $70 billion in trade by 2030? Or does something get in the way? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm reading every single one. Here's what I know. 16 months ago, both countries were throwing diplomats out. Today, they're signing uranium contracts that run for 8 years. That's not a photo op. That's infrastructure. Infrastructure built with Saskatchewan resources, Indian capital, and a handshake that neither side can afford to break. Markets that shift don't shift back. Supply chains that reroute don't return. And partnerships that get locked into 8-year contracts don't disappear because someone has a bad week. That's not optimism. That's arithmetic. If you haven't seen the breakdown of how Canada is building these partnerships while dealing with American tariffs, that context makes everything you just watched make a lot more sense. That video is right here. I'll see you there.